Good day, viewers, and welcome to Business PNG. Today we have with us Mr. Ernie Ganglock, who is the president of the PNG Business Council and a partner with Deloitte. Ernie, hello and welcome to the program.
Welcome, pleasure to be here.
Okay. Now, Ernie, could you explain to us a bit about the role of the Business Council?
Certainly, the Business Council of Papua New Guinea was formed some 11 years ago with a focus on promoting Papua New Guinea businesses. Not necessarily citizen businesses, but businesses that operate in Papua New Guinea. Traditionally, we've had business associations that have been focusing on either the mining sector, the oil industry, the agriculture sector, but there wasn't an organization that focused on the whole of Papua New Guinea. And so we were formed to be able to be that focus group. But I suppose our choice mandate is really to facilitate dialogue between the private sector and government. One of our key focus areas is to make sure that private sector concerns are conveyed to government, and vice versa, government's concerns in relation to how we can implement economic policy in terms of developing policy. They then communicate back to ourselves as the peak body of private sector, and then we see how we can assist government as well in terms of developing policies going forward. So it's a role basically to facilitate dialogue between government and the private sector. But as I said, but with a focus on promoting Papua New Guinean businesses.
Okay, to date, can you elaborate a bit more about some of the challenges that you've faced as a council with addressing some of those issues?
Certainly, as I said, some of the I suppose we call them impediments to business and investment. Our primary focus has been about addressing some of those issues, and whilst we've had some wins, in terms of some of the improvements to the law and order, some of the improvements to our visa processing in terms of being able to employ expatriate employees, our regulatory environment in terms of what IPA does and how it goes about registering businesses. We've had wins in that area. But as I said, the challenges still remain. And I suppose one of our biggest challenges is just to make sure that these things are always on the radar screen. We're always talking about government, we're always talking about how to address those impediments. It's been beneficial from the point of view of having a consistent government policy. So we haven't had to worry too much about changes to government policy. Whether the current government or the former government we're in, policy have pretty much remained the same. So in terms of our ability to try and address some of those issues, we've had that consistency in policy. So that's helped us to be able to get there. Obviously a concern is Papua New Guinea has had its ups and downs in terms of the issues being faced by PNG, like things with law and order, the lack of infrastructure. That's enabled, it's sort of restricted our ability to develop Papua New Guinea. And one of the things that we've found is that it's also a cost to businesses that most businesses in overseas countries don't include as part of their project evaluation. So we found that when investors come to PNG, these are additional costs that they've had to incur. And sometimes that's a deterrent for them to making that initial investment in Papua New Guinea. So we're always sort of talking to government about how we can address some of those issues. And I suppose that's been our biggest challenge is a lot of the business in PNG almost accept it as the cost of doing business. You know, the fact that they have to come and part of your initial setup is the cost of a generator, for example. You know, the lack of power supply, the lack of water. These are costs that have been borne by business in PNG. But for the new investor, these are expected to be delivered by the government. And so that's our challenge, is to try and make the government realize that these are costs that are actually impeding some of the investment decisions coming to PNG.
Okay. Now, what are some of the steps that the Council has taken directly with the government to address those specific challenges, as you mentioned, law and order and infrastructure problems?
As I said, the role of government is to develop policy, and the role of private sector is to assist with implementation of those policies, the creation of employment, the creation of wealth. And the only way we can do that and do it in a sustainable way is through regular dialogue with government. As President of the Business Council, I co-chair what they call the National Working Group on Impediments to Business. It is an NEC decision that created this working group. It's made up of all the key private sector organizations, as well as key government departments.
Can you name some of those organizations?
Certainly, the Business Council of PNG, the PNG Chamber of Commerce, the Chamber of Mines, the Institute of National Affairs, the Rural Industries Council, including the Indigenous Business of PNG, Business Council of PNG. That's on the private sector side. On the public sector, it's all the key departments: Finance, Treasury, the RC, IPA, Department of Planning. And these are part of, we get together every month and we sit down and discuss issues that we face. And it's a very valuable forum because it's not necessarily about us complaining to government or the government complaining to us. It's really about each party putting on the table some of the issues that we're facing, and together we try and work out a solution to go forward with some of those issues. For example, when we talk about infrastructure, we're aware of the lack of rehabilitation on the Highlands Highway, the lack of development in relation to port development, and some of the constraints faced by organizations like PNG Ports. As long as they can tell us what they're doing about some of those development issues, we're able to at least understand where they're coming from. And sometimes we just have to be patient about the government's, it doesn't happen overnight. And whilst it can be frustrating, at least by us knowing what the government's plans are, we can see how we can dovetail our arrangements into that. A good example of that is in relation to some of our mining companies, how they're able to assist with the rural development through the tax incentive, the tax credit scheme, where we realize that some of the infrastructure is an issue, but because of the consultative process between government and private sector, we're able to say, well, this is what we can do, and the government can do this bit. So together in partnership, we're able to address some of those issues. Okay. Law and order is one such issue. It's we realize that the government is restricted in terms of its ability to recruit. So, through our connections and through private sector, we also have dialogue with the Australian government and Australian private business. And so we're able to then put recommendations to them on how they can assist PNG in terms of developing that as well. So in terms of identifying the right resources we need, the right technology. So that's the role that we come in terms of facilitating some of those issues.
Okay, Ernie, we'll just take a quick commercial break and we'll be back after that.
Thank you.
Okay. Welcome back to the program, Business PNG. We are coming back to speaking with Ernie Glangle. Ernie, welcome back.
Thank you.
Okay, Ernie, is there any specific areas that you see, whether it's in the service industry or if it's with specific technology exchange, is there any one particular focus that you'd like to see a bit more development in?
Yes, certainly. From the Business Council's point of view, there are two key issues that we want to try and encourage. One is the development of our SME sector. Papua New Guinea has very good trades qualified people. We have very good electricians, carpenters, mechanics. But those people lack sort of financial and management skills. And one of the impediments to growth is the ability for these people to go and secure finance, to manage their books of accounts. So what we're trying to do is rather than employ an electrician from Queensland to go up there, we actually want this Queensland electrician business to come up and partner with a local electrician in Papua New Guinea. For a local welder here to partner with a local welder up there and do some sort of joint venture arrangement whereby the Papua New Guinean entrepreneur can then continue his trade but at the same time pick up some very good skills in terms of how to manage the business, how to manage financing. We also want to be able to give them a support package so they can actually go to the commercial banks and get a loan to build their business. We're talking to the Australians about making that possible for businesses here to come up to PNG. We're talking to IPA to try and streamline that process. We're also talking on our side to the Department of Trade, Commerce and Industry to try and create a database so we can track those people. So, a small business in Papua New Guinea wants to partner with somebody. He goes to the Department of Commerce, Trade and Industry, registers his interest. They then contact us as the Business Council and we try and partner with an Australian party that wants to do this. And Paul Nero, the Consul General in Brisbane, is quite keen. He's already started his database of Queensland businesses he wants to bring up to Papua New Guinea. We've now just got to match those two records and see who we can partner with. That's probably our first one. The second one is just to improve the level of dialogue between PNG and Australia. And by that, we have some key issues, whether it be institutional strengthening, whether it be law and order. So we want to try and identify agencies in PNG or in Australia who will come up and work with agencies in PNG. But we're trying to move away from the concept of getting advisors. We actually want to get people who can come up there and actually work in line positions. We want them to be responsible to the department secretaries. We want them to be responsible to the police commissioner. We don't want them coming up and actually being their sole purpose of just giving advice. Okay. It's about partnering in aligned positions so they can actually transfer the skills and learnings to their Papua New Guinean counterparts. So it's really, as I said, now we want to try and refine that requirement.
Okay. And in terms of that particular arrangement, when do you see that possibly coming into fruition?
Well, it's been on the agenda now for the last couple of years in terms of the ministerial dialogue. So the ministers from PNG and Australia have already had this discussion. We've now taken some of those resolutions from the ministerial forum, and we're now talking to, like in the case of the Business Council, talking to the Australia PNG Business Council, and our Foreign Affairs Department now talking to the Australian Foreign Affairs Department. So it's now about translating those resolutions into action plans, and that's what we're trying to do now, is this forum and the meetings we're having up during the forum, and leading up to the next ministerial forum at the end of the year. It's now about how do we actually convert those resolutions into implementation plans. And it's difficult because we've got to get buy-in from both sides, and one of the benefits of this forum is that we're able to then focus on the specific requirements. So it's not just a general request. It's a more specific request that we want to try and attend to. So.
Okay. Ernie, I guess really, can you explain to us a bit about what the remainder of the plans for the Business Council is for 2012?
Yeah, certainly, as I said, our concern is really about consistency in government policy. And as you're aware, in Papua, we have an election coming up next month. But as I said, from our point of view, we've been relatively happy with the role of government, particularly in the development of government policy, because both sides in Papua New Guinea haven't had any major issues in terms of where they want to take government policy. So there's been consistency from that point of view. Our concern obviously is in relation to the foreign investor looking at the PNG. Certainly the political happenings in Papua New Guinea over the last, or since August last year, have put some investors on edge. We've been very patient with government in terms of, let them sort their problems out, and then we'll then get involved. But it got to a stage last month where it was almost at the end of our patience. Something had to happen. So we did go and meet with the Prime Minister, and we gave him an assurance that if the elections could be held on time, then the private sector would then go back and tell our shareholders and tell our investors that it is just a little sort of speed bump along the road, and Papua New Guinea is actually still on track to implement and request some of those investment decisions. So I suppose our challenge is to make sure now that the elections do happen on time, and from our point of view, those investors are actually quite comfortable in coming forward.
Welcome back, viewers. Here we have with us Ernie Gangloff. Now, Ernie, could you explain to us a bit more about, I understand you're exploring some relationships with different councils within the Pacific and outside, for example, with Fiji Business Council, the Malaysian Business Council. Mm-hmm. Can you explain to a bit more about those relationships that you're exploring?
Yeah, certainly. As I said earlier, the role of the Business Council of PNG is to try and facilitate trade and investment promotion, both from an investor's point of view, but also in terms of dialogue with our government. And this probably started a couple of years ago when the then Minister of Foreign Affairs said to me and said, Ernie, we want to talk about trade. We get investment inquiries trade investment inquiries from all over the world. And they weren't sure who the private sector body to talk to were. So I said to them that we had, in fact, amended our constitution so that every sectoral body, every other peak body, was now a member of the Business Council. So in terms of a sole peak body that represents private sector, that was the Business Council. And as I said, our focus is about promoting PNG trade and investment. And that's not necessarily with Australia. Over the last couple of years, the similar associations have been set up in New Zealand, in Fiji, and they've come to us and said, we want to have this bilateral with New Zealand and Australia. We're now looking at promoting Fiji and PNG in terms of trade and investment. And PNG has always had a very successful primary industry export program with the European Union, particularly with our tuna resources.
Yes.
So it's also about developing that market. But those markets have been pretty much promoted previously on an industry basis. So it's been the fisheries has been targeting the European markets. It hasn't been a whole of country program. So the Business Council decided what we would do is we would link with fisheries and talk to the European Union, but it's then about promoting PNG products. But also, there are concerns in the European markets that our exports, we also want to talk about downstream processing for some of those exports. So it's not just about exporting fish.
All the products.
We then took it to another level and said to the European manufacturers, why don't you come to Papua New Guinea and invest? Because then that addressed our concerns in terms of building up our own manufacturing industry, our own down processing. We export a lot of raw materials, and then we import the finished products. And some of these are the PNG, raw ingredients. So we were trying to develop our own manufacturing industry. So whilst we're still continuing to export, we're now talking about investment in PNG for some of those manufacturers. And for that, we're talking to Europeans about that. We're talking to New Zealand. New Zealand, for example, love taro. We want to look at exporting our taro to New Zealand. There are issues that we need to address, but that dialogue is now happening. So in terms of our ability to promote trade and investment, it's also about bringing trade and investment into PNG to support, as I said, like our manufacturing sector, looking at developing our SME sector.
Okay, now Ernie, just in terms of, we're talking about a bit of the export of products, raw materials going to, especially with the fisheries going into the European markets and to New Zealand with taro, for example. Now, in terms of those particular products, there has been some issues raised with regard to the standards of, say, for example, safety standards, certifications and things like that. Now, what is the Council's role in sort of addressing that particular issue, which is becoming more sort of apparent in terms of doing now business in the economy?
What the Business Council has been doing, as I said, our role is basically to facilitate trade and investment. We're talking to the Australian quarantine people, are finding out exactly what their requirements are, and then we then talk to our government about putting those things in place. But from our point of view, the quarantine issues we can resolve. It's generally about investing in the right equipment to ensure that all our raw materials are processed, sprayed, for example. Our biggest concern is in relation to the consistency of supply. For example, when we talked about exporting taro to New Zealand, the initiative came from a group of women farmers in East Britain. But obviously, one of the concerns that we had with them is about the consistency of supply. So what we're trying to do is encourage, through the Department of Primary Industry, to have other taro growing provinces sign up to the same program.
Sure.
So in terms of supply, it didn't really matter where the taro came from. It's just if one province didn't have enough, we would then secure it from another province. And to us, that's one of the major concerns. If we were to sign up to supply a food chain in New Zealand, for example, for taro, we would need to ensure that they were guaranteed certain shipments every month, sort of 12 months a year.
Yeah.
And one of the good things about PNG is our weather allows us to grow these things, basically 24 months a year, or 12 months a year. It just allows us to be on production line 24/7.
Yeah.
So from that point of view, it's good, but it's about making sure that we're able to firstly grow it, and then secondly, we've then got the infrastructure to bring the produce to market. And so there are a number of challenges that we're faced internally before we can actually start exporting. But the relationship about the bilateral arrangements, to us, that's a huge plus. It not just opens up the PNG markets to overseas investors, but also opens up overseas investors to the PNG products as well. So it's not just about exporting, it's also about importing that we want to try and promote.
Okay, now Ernie, we've spoken a lot about the Council's role, how you're interacting with the government and also other parties of interest outside of PNG. And some of the challenges that doing business in Papua New Guinea. Now, is there a specific or is there a message that you'd like to give to new investors coming into the country and existing investors that we have?
Certainly, I think the message from the Business Council of PNG to particularly new investors is one that since the global financial crisis, Papua New Guinea is one of maybe half a dozen countries where we're experiencing sort of greater than 5% GDP growth on an annual basis. The future in Papua New Guinea is very, very rewarding. Yes, as a developing nation, we have development issues, but generally what we encourage you to do is to speak to the businesses and the chambers that already exist within Papua New Guinea, our high commissions, our embassies throughout the world. have this information available, and we can offer something that very few other countries can offer, and that is an investment climate that is rewarding for those that are willing to make that investment. We have a country that is abundant in resources. We have labour that is relatively cost effective. We have great weather all year round. Our political scenario, our political situation, despite what people may perceive, is relatively stable. And if you look at our 36-year history, we are a nation of 800 languages, and we offer a very good investment climate to any potential investor. And certainly, as I said, with our expected growth over the next 10 to 15 years, we offer a good long-term investment for overseas investors. And certainly from the investors already in Papua New Guinea, our financial system is such that it is very liquid. We certainly look at investing more in Papua New Guinea, and we're seeing a greater involvement now of Papua New Guineans in businesses. And to that, we're calling on overseas investors to partner with Papua New Guineans to try and build our economy, as I said, create investment. So we're very, very positive about Papua New Guinea going forward.
Ernie, thank you so much for coming onto the program and giving us a rundown of what the Business Council is doing for Papua New Guinea, and we wish you a successful 2012.
Thank you very much.
And viewers, that was Ernie Gangloff, the President of the PNG Business Council and partner with Deloitte. And thank you for joining Business PNG.